Snow fell in thick curtains over the ruined schoolhouse, burying the broken windows and the silence of a town that no longer remembered peace. Inside, a quiet woman knelt among frightened children, her voice steady, her hands calm. The soldiers who broke down the door laughed when they saw her, certain she was nothing more than a frightened teacher, worth less than a hostage. But when the commanding officer demanded her name for the execution record, she looked at him without fear and said only, "Evelyn Hayes." The room went still. Outside, on the frozen field, a line of snipers lowered their rifles at once, as though the wind itself had spoken. A name buried for 20 years had just risen out of the snow. The village had once been called Ashwood Hollow, though almost no one alive still used the name. It sat in a valley between two pine ridges, the kind of place travelers passed without noticing, until the war came and gave it a reason to be remembered. Snow arrived early that winter and never left, blanketing the collapsed roofs and the skeletal fences, turning the world into something colorless and patient. At the center of it all stood a schoolhouse, its bricks scarred by shrapnel, its windows patched with plywood and prayer. Inside, 12 children sat on mismatched chairs, wrapped in coats too thin for the cold, and in front of them stood a woman named Evelyn Hayes. She was 38 years old. Though the war had aged her in ways numbers could not measure, her hair was tied back plainly, her sweater patched at the elbows, her voice never rising above the sound of falling snow. When the pounding of distant artillery rattled the windows, she did not flinch. She simply continued the lesson, guiding small hands across worn pages, as though the world outside the walls belonged to someone else's war. The villagers who remained knew little about her past, only that she had arrived 3 years earlier with a single bag and a silence that discouraged questions. Rumors floated through the ruined streets, whispers that she had once served in the military, though no one could say in what capacity, and Evelyn never corrected or confirmed a single word of it. Each morning she walked the same path from the small house at the edge of the village to the schoolhouse, her boots leaving neat prints in fresh snow. She carried chalk in her coat pocket and bread in a cloth bag, sharing both freely with children who had lost more than their fathers could count. The old women of Ashwood Hollow called her the Quiet One, and meant it as both a compliment and a warning, for there was something in her stillness that unsettled even the bravest men. She never spoke of family, never wrote letters, never seemed to expect anything from the world beyond another day of survival for her students. And when the wind screamed through the broken shutters at night, she would sit alone by candlelight, her eyes fixed on some distant point that no one else could see. There was a discipline to her that no one in the village could quite explain, a habit of noticing things before anyone else did. She always knew, seconds before the first shell landed, which direction to move the children, as though some old instinct still counted distance and timing beneath her calm exterior. She kept the schoolhouse windows taped in careful patterns to prevent flying glass, taught the older students how to move low along the walls during shelling, and never once explained why she knew such things so precisely. When a wounded soldier from the resistance passed through the village seeking shelter, she treated his injuries with a steadiness that surprised even the town's aging doctor, her hands sure and unshaking as she worked. He asked her once, quietly, where she had learned such skill, and she answered only that everyone learns what they need to survive, offering nothing further before turning back to her patients. The soldier left 2 days later, and though he never spoke her name to anyone, he carried away a strange certainty that he had met someone the war had once depended upon. The children adored her in the uncomplicated way children love the adults who make them feel safe, unaware of the quiet vigilance behind her gentle patience. She organized her lessons around small rituals, a song before arithmetic, a story before the reading hour, anything that gave the days a shape the war could not entirely erase. Winter mornings began with her checking the tree line from the schoolhouse doorway before allowing a single child through the gate, a habit so practiced it seemed like nothing more than caution born of hard times. No one questioned it, because in a world where danger could fall from the sky without warning, caution seemed like simple wisdom rather than the residue of another life entirely. She had built, brick by careful brick, an existence so ordinary that even she had almost begun to believe in it. On the morning the war finally reached the village gates, the sky had turned the color of ash long before the first engines were heard. Evelyn had just begun the alphabet lesson when the ground trembled beneath the floorboards, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the low growl of trucks rose above the wind. She did not raise her voice, she simply closed the book in her hands, looked toward the door, and told the children it was time to be very quiet. Outside, smoke began to rise over the tree line, and the peaceful stillness of Ashwood Hollow shattered into the sound of boots on frozen ground. The children moved quickly, trained by months of drills that Evelyn had insisted upon without ever explaining why. She guided them down the narrow stairwell behind the classroom, into the cellar where sacks of grain and old desks had been pushed aside to make room for exactly this moment. One by one, she counted them into the dark, her hand resting briefly on each small shoulder, her voice a whisper of reassurance that asked for nothing but trust. When the last child disappeared into the shadows, she pulled the wooden door shut and turned the iron lock, the sound swallowed instantly by the roar of engines outside. She did not follow them down. Instead, she turned back toward the empty classroom, toward the door that was already splintering under the weight of rifle butts, and she waited. The soldiers who burst through the entrance expected resistance, weapons, perhaps a hidden fighter crouched behind a desk. What they found instead was a woman standing alone in the center of the room, her hands raised slightly, her expression unreadable. They searched her roughly, tearing at her coat pockets, expecting to find a radio or a blade, but their hands closed only around sticks of chalk and a folded piece of paper covered in children's handwriting. Laughter spread through the small unit, sharp and mocking, as one soldier held up the chalk like a trophy and called her nothing more than an old schoolteacher, a waste of ammunition. Evelyn said nothing, her face calm even as they shoved her toward the door, her eyes briefly finding the locked cellar and lingering there for the length of a single breath. It was an older soldier, gray at the temples, weathered by years no training could erase, who noticed something the others missed. As they forced her coat collar aside to bind her wrists, he caught sight of a thin, pale scar running along the back of her neck, disappearing beneath her hairline. His breath caught in his throat, and the color drained from his face so quickly that the man beside him asked if he was ill. He said nothing, only stared at Evelyn with the look of a man who had seen a ghost step out of old photographs, and for reasons he could not yet explain, his hands began to tremble around his rifle. Evelyn met his gaze for the briefest moment, calm and unreadable, before the soldiers pushed her forward into the snow, toward the waiting trucks and the long road to the enemy base beyond the ridge. The base sat in what had once been a mining outpost, its concrete buildings scarred by decades of use, its perimeter lined with watchtowers that pierced the gray sky like blackened teeth. Evelyn was marched through the gates with her wrists bound, snow catching in her hair, her expression carrying none of the fear the guards expected from a captured civilian. Word of the strange capture had already spread ahead of her, whispered from soldier to soldier, though none could yet say why. An old sniper's unease had rippled through the ranks like a current beneath ice. She was brought before Colonel Viktor Sokolov, a broad man in his 50s whose eyes had long since stopped registering surprise at anything the war placed before him. He studied her for a long moment, unimpressed, before beginning the routine questions reserved for prisoners who mattered little. His voice was flat, businesslike, the tone of a man who had processed hundreds of captives without a second thought. He asked for her occupation, and she answered simply that she was a teacher. He asked why a teacher would remain in a war zone long after others had fled, and she said only that someone had to stay for the children. Victor's pen hovered over the intake form, indifferent, ready to close the file and move on to matters of greater consequence. Then he asked for her name, the final formality before the paperwork was filed and forgotten, and she answered without hesitation, her voice as calm as it had been in the schoolroom. Evelyn Hayes. For a moment, nothing happened. The name meant nothing to Victor, one more entry among thousands collected over years of war, and he nearly waved the guards forward to take her to holding, but the door behind him opened before he could finish the gesture, and Ivan Petrov, the base's finest marksman, stepped inside on unrelated business, his eyes drifting toward the prisoner out of idle curiosity. What happened next would be repeated in whispers throughout the base for days afterward, retold with the kind of disbelief usually reserved for ghost stories. Ivan froze mid-step, his rifle slipping from his shoulder, and striking the concrete floor with a sound that echoed through the room like a gunshot. His face went pale, his lips parted, and the word that finally escaped him was barely audible. Impossible. Victor turned toward his top marksman with irritation, demanding an explanation for the outburst, but Ivan seemed unable to look away from the woman standing quietly in the center of the room. He had spent years training on classified materials passed down through generations of snipers, documents that detailed impossible shots, engagements considered unrepeatable by any living marksman. Every one of those files carried the same signature at the bottom of the page, a call sign whispered like legend among those who studied the craft of long-range killing. White Raven. Ivan had memorized every recorded engagement attributed to that name, had studied the wind calculations and the impossible angles until they haunted his dreams, believing the shooter behind them had either died or vanished decades ago. Now he stood in a cramped interrogation room, staring at a woman who called herself a schoolteacher, and something in his instincts told him the legend had never actually disappeared at all. News of the moment spread through the base faster than any radio transmission could have carried it. Soldiers gathered in doorways and hallways, whispering the same two words that Ivan had spoken aloud. The name passed from mouth to mouth like a live wire no one wanted to hold. Victor dismissed it as superstition, a nervous marksman spooked by rumor and cold weather, and ordered the prisoner moved to the detention block without further delay. Yet even as the guards led her away, he noticed the way conversations died when she passed, the way hardened men stepped aside without being ordered to, their eyes following her with something close to dread. He told himself it meant nothing, that legends were built from exaggeration and fear, not fact. But somewhere beneath his certainty, a small and unfamiliar doubt had already begun to take root. In the detention block, the guards assigned to watch her found themselves oddly reluctant to meet her eyes, speaking to one another in low voices as though she might somehow overhear thoughts they had not yet spoken aloud. One young soldier, barely 20 years old, brought her a blanket without being ordered to, mumbling an apology for the cold before hurrying back to his post. Evelyn thanked him quietly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, her posture giving away nothing of the calculations already forming behind her calm expression. She had counted the guards during the walk from the interrogation room, noted the positions of the cameras, the timing of the patrol rotations, details absorbed without conscious effort, the way another person might notice the weather. It was not escape she was planning, not yet, but preparation, the same quiet readiness that had kept her alive through every situation the war had ever placed before her. Ivan, meanwhile, retreated to the armory alone, sitting with the old training files spread across a metal table, rereading pages he had memorized years earlier as though they might now explain something new. He found himself comparing sketches of terrain to the layout of the very base he stood in, recalculating angles and wind patterns from engagements he had once studied only as historical curiosities. The realization settling over him was not simply that White Raven had returned, but that everything he thought he understood about his own skill now stood in question. He had trained for years to become the finest marksman in his command, only to discover that the standard against which he had measured himself was still very much alive, and closer than he ever imagined. The story that circulated through the base that night belonged to a war fought 2 decades earlier, in mountains far from the frozen valley where Ashwood Hollow now lay buried in snow. In those years, a sniper known only as White Raven had become something between a soldier and a myth, a shooter whose name was spoken in briefing rooms with equal parts respect and fear. She had never missed a confirmed target, a claim so extraordinary that intelligence officers on both sides of the conflict had spent years trying to verify or disprove it. Unlike other snipers whose reputations were built on body counts, White Raven had built hers on something rarer, a long list of hostages and captured soldiers pulled alive from situations considered unsalvageable. Enemy commanders had once placed a bounty worth millions on her identity, offering fortune and rank to anyone who could unmask the woman behind the name. Her legend had been built not on numbers but on restraint, a quality rare enough among snipers that commanders on both sides had struggled to categorize her properly. Where other marksmen were measured by confirmed kills, White Raven's file was measured by something stranger, the count of lives she had chosen to spare when a simpler soldier would have simply fired. Hostage situations considered unsolvable by every unit sent before her had ended, again and again, with captors disarmed and civilians walking free, often without a single shot ever being traced back to her position. Enemy analysts had once built an entire psychological profile around her, convinced that understanding her mercy might reveal a weakness they could exploit, yet every attempt to predict her only proved how little they truly understood. She became, in time, less a soldier to be defeated and more a force to be avoided altogether, a name commanders learned to fear precisely because it so rarely meant death. Then, without warning, she vanished. No final mission was ever recorded, no farewell transmission, no grave marked with her name. Some said she had died quietly during an unlisted operation, her body lost to a mountain that had claimed hundreds before her. Others insisted she had simply walked away from the war, unable to carry the weight of what she had done, choosing to disappear rather than continue killing in service of causes that no longer made sense to her. A few of the older veterans, the ones who had served closest to her, whispered a different explanation entirely, that she had grown tired of being a legend and had chosen, quite deliberately, to become no one at all. The files describing her exploits had eventually been sealed, then declassified for training purposes only, stripped of every detail except the tactics that made her impossible to predict. For 20 years, White Raven had existed only as a name in old documents and a fading rumor around campfires, until a soldier's trembling hands sent that same name echoing through a base in the snow. Despite the murmurs spreading like fever through the ranks, Victor refused to entertain the possibility that a middle-aged schoolteacher could be the ghost his enemies once feared. He reasoned that legends grew larger with every retelling, that the real White Raven, if she had ever existed at all, was almost certainly dead or too old to matter. To him, Evelyn Hayes was simply a woman who had chosen the wrong village to hide in, a convenient example to remind the surrounding towns of what resistance would cost. He gave the order that same evening, cold and final, instructing his men to prepare the courtyard for an execution at dawn. It would be quick, efficient, and above all, a demonstration of power meant to silence whatever doubts had crept into his soldier's mind. Whatever she once was, he told himself, she was only human now, and humans could be made to kneel in the snow like anyone else. Dawn arrived without color, the sky and ground blending into a single sheet of gray as snow continued its slow, relentless descent over the base. Evelyn was led into the courtyard with her hands bound before her, her steps unhurried despite the rifles already forming a line ahead of her. She did not struggle, did not plead, did not offer the fear the soldiers had been trained to expect from prisoners in her position. Instead, she walked to the center of the courtyard as though it were simply another path she had chosen to take, her eyes calm beneath the falling snow. Victor watched from a short distance, arms folded, waiting for the moment to prove that legends meant nothing against the discipline of his men. The firing squad assembled in a straight line, 10 soldiers with rifles raised, their breath fogging in the freezing air as they awaited the order. Evelyn turned toward them slowly, her expression neither pleading nor defiant, simply present, as though she were addressing students who had asked a difficult question. She spoke only once, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry across the silent courtyard, warning them gently against a choice they would carry with them long after the war ended. Don't do something you'll regret for the rest of your life. No one fired. The soldiers stood frozen, rifles trembling in hands that had killed before without hesitation, yet now refused to obey a command they had followed 100 times over. High above the courtyard, in the watchtowers ringing the base's most experienced marksmen found themselves suddenly unwilling to hold their positions. One by one, they requested rotation, citing failing eyesight or numb fingers, excuses so thin that even the officers granting them knew better than to ask further questions. It was not fear of retaliation that moved through them, but something harder to name, an instinct passed down through years of training that recognized, without needing proof, exactly who stood in that courtyard. No one wanted to be the one who pulled the trigger on a name that had haunted their manuals since childhood. Victor watched the hesitation spread through his most disciplined men with mounting fury, disbelief curdling into rage at the sight of an entire base losing its nerve over an unarmed woman. Unable to tolerate the silence any longer, Victor stepped forward and tore the rifle from the nearest soldier's hands, his jaw set, his patience finally exhausted. If his men lacked the will to finish what he had ordered, he would prove to them, and to the ghost standing calmly in the snow, that legends could still be ended by a single bullet. He raised the weapon himself, his finger finding the trigger, his eyes locked on Evelyn's unshaken gaze across the short distance between them. The courtyard held its breath, snow falling silently over soldiers who could not look away, waiting for the moment that would either confirm or shatter everything they believed about the woman before them. Just as his finger began to tighten, a single gunshot rang out from beyond the perimeter, sharp and distant, cutting through the frozen air like a blade. The shot had not come from Victor's weapon, nor from anyone standing in the courtyard, but from somewhere far beyond the base's outer fence line, where snow and pine trees blurred together into an indistinguishable wall of white. Confusion rippled through the soldiers as the sound echoed off the surrounding hills, followed almost immediately by a second and third shot, closer this time, striking the guard towers with precise, deliberate force. Captain Mason Reed had launched his rescue operation exactly as planned, his reconnaissance team moving through the tree line under cover of the storm, striking the base's weakest points before the garrison could organize a defense. Smoke bombs detonated near the eastern wall, thick gray clouds rolling across the courtyard and swallowing the execution scene in seconds. Soldiers scattered in every direction, shouting orders that contradicted one another, the disciplined formation collapsing into chaos as gunfire erupted from multiple directions at once. Amid the confusion, Evelyn moved with a calm that belonged to someone who had lived through 100 battles just like this one, though no one nearby had time to notice the change in her. She used the smoke and disorder to slip toward the courtyard's edge, her bound wrists working loose against a rope she had already weakened during the long walk from her cell. Watching the chaos unfold, she read the layout of the base instantly, the angles of fire, the blind spots in the walls, the places where Mason's team would inevitably become exposed. Using signals she had not needed in 20 years, small gestures with her hands and precise movements toward cover, she began guiding the rescue operation without a single word spoken aloud. Somewhere on the ridge above, a hidden observer noticed the signals and adjusted the team's approach accordingly, though he could not yet explain how he understood them so instinctively. As the battle intensified, Ivan Petrov positioned himself on the roof of the command building, scanning the chaos below through his scope with practiced patience. He located Captain Mason Reed moving through the smoke near the eastern wall, exposed for barely a second as he directed his team toward the detention block. It was enough. Ivan adjusted his aim, accounting for wind and distance, with the same precision that had made him the base's most feared marksman, his breath slowing as his finger found the trigger. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Mason Reed's life narrowed down to a single, unguarded moment beneath the falling snow, unaware that a bullet was already prepared to end it. The gunfire had reduced the courtyard to a battlefield of shifting shadows, smoke rolling low across the snow while soldiers on both sides fought for control of positions no longer clearly marked. Evelyn moved through the chaos without a weapon of her own, her bound wrists finally free, her eyes scanning the rooftops with the trained precision of someone who had spent a lifetime reading battlefields before they revealed themselves. She saw Ivan settle into position atop the command building, his rifle steady, his focus locked onto a target she recognized instantly. From the signals she had been sending only moments before, there was no time to shout a warning that would carry over the noise of battle, no path close enough to intervene by hand. Instead, her eyes fell upon a rifle abandoned in the snow beside a fallen soldier, its stock still warm from recent use. She knelt and lifted it without hesitation, the weight of the weapon settling into her hands as though no time had passed since she last held one. 20 years of silence dissolved in an instant, replaced by instincts that had never truly left her, only slept beneath the surface of chalk dust and quiet mornings. She raised the rifle, ignoring the storm around her, her breathing slowing into the same controlled rhythm she had once used to steady a shot across impossible distances. Wind cut sideways through the courtyard, snow swirling unpredictably, conditions that would have made most marksmen hesitate before committing to a shot. Evelyn did not hesitate. She fired once, the sound swallowed by the greater roar of battle, sending the bullet through the storm and into Ivan's rifle barrel a fraction of a second before he could complete his own shot. The impact sent Ivan's weapon spinning from his hands, the shock traveling up his arms as sparks flew from the ruined barrel, saving Mason Reed's life by a margin measured in inches. Down in the courtyard, Mason staggered but remained unharmed, unaware of how close he had come to death, or of the woman who had just saved him from a rooftop away. Soldiers from both sides paused amid the chaos, staring toward the source of the impossible shot, disbelief spreading across faces that had already begun to suspect the truth. Ivan rose slowly from his position, staring down at his destroyed weapon and then toward the courtyard where Evelyn stood in plain sight for the first time since her capture. He said nothing for a long moment, the wind howling between them, before raising his voice loud enough to reach across the battlefield, calling out a challenge no soldier had spoken aloud in 20 years, demanding to face White Raven directly. The fighting around them slowed to an uneasy standstill as word of the challenge spread across both sides of the conflict, an unspoken agreement settling over the battlefield that something greater than the immediate skirmish was about to unfold. Ivan retrieved a second rifle from a fallen comrade, his hands steady despite the humiliation of moments earlier, his pride demanding a rematch under conditions of his own choosing. Evelyn accepted without argument, her expression unreadable, as though duels like this one had once been as ordinary to her as grading homework now was. The two marksmen were led to opposite ridgelines overlooking a wide, snow-covered valley, a distance so vast that most soldiers considered an accurate shot across it nearly impossible. Word passed quickly among both sides that the war, for a brief and strange moment, would pause to witness a contest between two legends, one confirmed and one still uncertain. The valley stretched more than 2,000 meters between the two ridges, a distance that stripped away any illusion of an easy shot, demanding precision measured in fractions of a degree. Wind tore across the open space in unpredictable gusts, driving snow sideways in sheets that obscured visibility for seconds at a time, conditions that would humble even the most decorated marksman. Ivan settled into position first, adjusting his scope with practiced urgency, his calculations rapid but slightly rushed. Driven by the sting of his earlier failure, he fired a testing shot toward a marked stake near the valley's center, the bullet striking close but not exact, the wind stealing precision from his aim in ways he had not fully accounted for. Frustration flickered across his face as he recalibrated, aware that Evelyn had not yet fired a single round, watching him instead with quiet, patient eyes from across the vast white expanse. Evelyn did not rush. She studied the terrain first, reading the way snow drifted along the ridgeline, the subtle shifts in wind speed carried by the movement of distant pine branches, details most marksmen would have overlooked entirely. She adjusted her position slightly, accounting for elevation and humidity, factors buried deep in muscle memory that required no conscious calculation after decades of instinct. When she finally raised her rifle, her breathing slowed into stillness, the storm around her fading into irrelevant noise, the way it always had during the moments that mattered most. She fired a single shot, the sound swallowed instantly by the wind, the bullet crossing the impossible distance in a path invisible to every eye but her own. The bullet struck the same marked stake Ivan had aimed for, splitting it cleanly down its center, a shot so precise it silenced the murmurs that had been building among the watching soldiers. Ivan lowered his rifle slowly, staring across the valley in stunned recognition of a skill he had only ever read about in classified training documents. He raised his weapon once more, determined not to be outdone, firing in rapid succession toward a secondary target, his shots landing close but never matching the exactness of his rival's single attempt. Sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the freezing air, his composure cracking in small, visible ways, a tightening of the jaw, a shortening of breath, the unmistakable signs of a marksman losing the quiet mind his craft demanded. Evelyn watched him with something close to sympathy rather than triumph, understanding that his pride, not his skill, had become his greatest obstacle in that moment. Among the soldiers gathered along both ridgelines, whispers began to shift from doubt into something closer to reverence, an unspoken agreement forming that they were witnessing something none of them would ever see again. Lucas Grant, the Allied sniper commander who had trained under stories of White Raven without ever believing them fully true, watched through his own scope with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet vindication. He had spent years insisting to skeptical officers that the old case files were not exaggeration, that a marksman capable of such feats had truly existed once, and now he watched proof of it unfold across an impossible valley. Victor, still positioned at the base below, received updates by radio with growing unease, each report chipping away further at the certainty he had clung to since morning. When the duel reached its final round, Evelyn raised her rifle toward Ivan's own position rather than a marked target, the barrel aligning with a precision that could easily have ended his life in an instant. She fired. The bullet passed within centimeters of Ivan's shoulder, close enough to tear a hole through the fabric of his coat, yet leaving him entirely unharmed, the shot deliberately measured to prove a point rather than take a life. Silence spread across both ridgelines as soldiers realized what had just happened, that the woman capable of striking a target across 2,000 meters had chosen, quite intentionally, not to kill him. Ivan lowered his weapon completely, understanding settling over him slowly, a mixture of humility and something close to respect, replacing the fury that had driven him only minutes earlier. Evelyn's message required no words, though she offered a few regardless, her voice carrying evenly across the distance between them. I don't kill when I don't have to. It was a rule that had once defined her entire career, one that no amount of time or forgetting had ever managed to erase from who she truly was. The uneasy calm that followed the duel shattered when new orders reached the base, carried by radio from a commander unwilling to accept defeat on any terms. Colonel Victor, humiliated by the display of skill that had unfolded before his own soldiers, retreated to a final and desperate strategy, one that abandoned every remaining shred of honor his men had witnessed. He ordered several of the schoolchildren, captured earlier when the cellar had eventually been discovered, brought forward as leverage against the woman who had embarrassed him twice in a single morning. Standing atop the ridge overlooking the valley, he delivered his ultimatum through a soldier positioned within shouting distance, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen air. "Surrender now, or the children pay the price for every bullet fired against my men today." Evelyn's expression did not change, though something in her eyes hardened into a focus that had not been present even during the duel moments earlier. She lowered her rifle slowly, understanding immediately that no shot, however precise, could resolve a situation built entirely around the safety of innocent lives. Turning to Mason Reed, who had rejoined the ridge with his surviving team, she spoke quietly, her instructions brief and absolute, leaving no room for argument or delay. She would return to the base alone, unarmed, and buy whatever time was necessary for his team to reach the children before Victor's patience expired completely. Mason objected immediately, recognizing the danger in walking directly into the hands of an enemy who had already ordered her execution once that morning, but Evelyn was already moving before he could finish his protest. She descended the ridge alone, her boots sinking into deep snow, her hands raised in clear surrender as she approached the base's shattered gates for the second time that day. Soldiers watched her advance with a mixture of confusion and unease, uncertain how to process a woman who had just demonstrated impossible skill only to walk willingly back into captivity. Victor met her in the courtyard, triumph flickering across his face as he ordered his men to lower their weapons from the children and secure the woman who had caused him so much trouble. Evelyn placed her rifle in the snow at her feet, her expression calm, her posture entirely without resistance. But as Victor stepped closer to confirm her surrender, believing the danger fully contained, he made the same mistake countless enemies before him had made against White Raven, allowing himself a single moment of careless confidence. In that brief instant, as Victor reached to grip her arm, Evelyn moved with a speed that defied every assumption anyone in that courtyard had made about her. Her hand closed around his wrist, twisting sharply, disarming him before his own soldiers could react to what was happening only feet away from them. She forced him to his knees in the snow, his own pistol now pressed lightly against his side, her voice low and controlled as she instructed his men to release the children immediately. Confusion turned to compliance within seconds, soldiers lowering their weapons across the courtyard as Mason's team arrived through the gates behind her, securing the children and the remaining base personnel without a single additional shot fired. Victor knelt in silence, defeated not by superior firepower, but by the simple truth that he had underestimated a woman the entire war had somehow forgotten to remember correctly. By nightfall, the base had surrendered completely, and the name White Raven, spoken only in legend for 2 decades, now belonged once again to the history of the war, confirmed beyond any remaining doubt. Word of the battle at Ashwood Hollow spread quickly through both military circles and the surrounding villages, though Evelyn herself requested that her role be recorded with as little detail as possible. Military officials arrived within days, eager to formally recognize her contribution, offering medals, promotions, and a return to active service befitting someone of her rediscovered legend. She declined every offer extended to her, explaining simply that the war had already taken everything it needed from her many years earlier, and she intended to give it nothing further. Captain Mason Reed personally thanked her for saving his life on that rooftop, a debt he insisted he could never fully repay, though Evelyn brushed the sentiment aside with the same quiet humility that had defined her since her arrival in the village. Within weeks, as peace negotiations began in the region, the schoolhouse at the center of Ashwood Hollow was rebuilt from the ground up, its walls stronger, its windows finally whole again. Spring arrived slowly that year, melting the snow in patches across fields that had once been stained by war, revealing green ground beneath months of frozen silence. Evelyn returned to the classroom exactly as she always had, chalk in hand, her voice steady as she guided small groups of children through lessons that had nothing to do with rifles or ridgelines. The villagers who had once whispered about her mysterious past now watched her with a different kind of respect, though she never encouraged the stories that continued to spread in her absence. She asked for nothing beyond the simple continuation of her daily routine, the walk to school each morning, the quiet hours spent teaching children to read and write in a world finally beginning to heal. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through newly installed windows, a young student raised her hand and asked the question that had followed Evelyn since the battle months earlier. "Were you really a hero?" the girl asked, her eyes wide with the kind of curiosity only children seem capable of holding without judgment. Evelyn paused for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful thought she gave to everything else in her life. She smiled gently, kneeling beside the girl's desk, and offered an answer that carried the weight of everything she had chosen to become. "I'm just a teacher," she said, her voice soft but certain, closing the subject as gently as she had closed it for 20 years before that day in the snow. On the schoolhouse wall, beside a row of children's drawings and a faded map of the region, a small framed photograph remained largely unnoticed by most who passed it. It showed a much younger Evelyn in uniform, standing beside a rifle case in a landscape of distant mountains, a record from a life few in the village would ever fully understand. Beneath the photograph, a simple plaque carried 3 lines of text, weathered slightly, but still legible to anyone who paused long enough to read them closely. Major Evelyn Hayes, call sign, White Raven, the sniper who chose peace. Captain Mason Reed visited the village once more before his unit was reassigned, standing quietly at the back of the classroom as Evelyn guided her students through a lesson on simple fractions. He did not interrupt, content simply to watch a woman who had once redefined the meaning of precision now spend her mornings teaching children how to divide a loaf of bread fairly among friends. Before he left, he asked her only one question, wondering aloud whether she ever regretted stepping away from the life that had made her a legend across 2 wars. Evelyn considered it for a long moment, watching the children bent over their worksheets, their futures still soft and unwritten in a way hers had never truly been. "No," she said finally, "some battles are worth fighting, but the only one worth winning forever is the quiet after it ends." Lucas Grant later included her story, without names, in the training materials he prepared for a new generation of marksmen, teaching not the mechanics of her impossible shots but the discipline of her restraint. He told his students that the greatest skill a sniper could ever possess was not the ability to take a life from any distance, but the wisdom to know precisely when not to. Somewhere far from any battlefield, a woman who had once been the most feared name in her profession read those same lessons over a cup of tea, unrecognized, unbothered, entirely at peace with the anonymity she had chosen. Outside, snow began to fall once more over Ashwood Hollow, gentle and unhurried, settling quietly across a village that had finally learned to breathe again. Inside the rebuilt schoolhouse, the voices of children reciting their morning lessons rose softly into the winter air, carrying forward a peace that one quiet woman had chosen, again and again, to protect.